So many of you have talked about issues around sexuality, and the Global Fund for Women has been very proud to have been a long-time supporter of lesbian rights activism and transgender activism in many different parts of the world. But it is true, and I recently spoke to this at another meeting, that for feminists around the world and for women's movements as a whole, it hasn't always been an easy place to welcome or to be inclusive of lesbian rights as part of this agenda. How can this invisibility be changed, and how can more women's organizations be encouraged to include and specifically to hire lesbian staff?
Our experience is WWHI is one of the first organizations who hired open lesbian women in Turkey. By the way, not only lesbian, we're also the first organization which hired a gay man and a transsexual, female-to-male transsexual, and then the other way around transsexual, and now we have a heterosexual, feminist heterosexual man, etc. But apart from that, I mean, that's been our policy from the beginning on, because of the interconnectedness of power structures. So it's not only a matter of women, for example, or Kurdish women, for example, for us, we always had Kurdish women, or Jewish women, you know? So it's the same thing, but I think I'll give you a very good example from our the Penal Code campaign. Until the Penal Code campaign, which started, which I've just told, in 2001, women's movements, women's organizations had not been openly working together with gay and lesbian organizations in Turkey. So in 2001, as we started the Penal Code campaign, definitely, as you can imagine, was one of the issues sexual orientation, okay? Because if you're talking about sexuality, we had about 40 methods. Of course, the issue came up. So it had started out as a women's group, okay, with the core group which started it was 15 organizations, the campaign. Later on, we became 50 organizations. So, of course, the issue came up. So the issue of sexual orientation came up. So then at one point, I said, look, if the issue is there, how come we're not going to work with LGBT organizations? Yeah. So the issue was okay, but so there has been a lot of hesitance, there has been a lot of debate and discussions. It was difficult, but at one point, we did come together, the women's organizations, and I'll never forget the first day we went to Parliament. I mean, it was okay to work together in the names, having their names, and then we constantly had to go to Parliament. Like every 3 weeks, we had to go to the Parliament. So then at one point, of course, we asked also the LGBT organizations to come with us to the Parliament, or they said they will come to the Parliament, I forgot now, but we went together. I never forget this. In this hall, you know, the Turkish Parliament has big halls. Feminists are working on this side, the LGBT is working on this, and I'm working in the middle, in this long corridor. So it was like, you know, there's all these, in German, Berührungsangst, this fear of touching, you know, but now, I'm talking, this is year 2002 or 2003. Now it's 2010. Turkey is one of the countries where the LGBT organizations and women's organizations are working together on almost any issue. 7 years. I mean, so we just start and it happens. I mean, that's the lesson I think we learned.
Debbie, we've been hearing about a very different reality in so many countries in Africa where actually laws are being passed, including in Uganda right now. And I know that's put women's organizations often in a very difficult space. Is there something you could add to that question that was...
Well, I think the situation is a bit different in Africa because we're still preoccupied with so many basic issues. Basic issues to do with just, basic poverty, shelter, health, and all that kind of thing. And I don't think we have yet a strong LGBT movement as such. I don't think there's, and there could be a handful of people who are openly gay or lesbian, but many of them might still be hidden, and we're therefore working with them. You know, we're continuing to do whatever.
It's also very dangerous to be out in many different parts of.
For my country, Uganda, I don't think it's particularly dangerous. It's just that the women's movement generally has been preoccupied with so many of these other basic issues, conflict, peace building, you know, that whole realm of issues, that this hasn't yet come up as the agenda for the women's movement generally.
Do you think that's sort of falling into the trap of this hierarchy of oppressions? I mean, I think we get asked at the Global Fund very similar questions. You know, when so many women are living in extreme poverty, why are you funding lesbian rights organization? And I think our response is human rights is not sort of a layered pyramid where, you know, first you get food, then you get political rights, then you get a job, then you get, and then ultimately you can think about your sexuality. But rather that, again, as we said, as feminists, if our understanding is one of the deep intersectionality of all of these, then our approach to human rights should be in the same way, one that values and gives voice to that. And I know from my own experiences in working on this in India, we've had very similar kinds of, you know, arguments, which is the mainstream larger women's movements have said, oh, please, you know, this is something that is an elite, this is an elite privilege. And actually, my first meeting with one of the first women's lesbian groups in India was actually very humbling, because it was a group of working class women, receptionists, police officers, women who were sweepers, who had been often forced into marriage at a very early age, who had experienced extreme gender violence at the hands of their husbands, and who simply just loved other women. And so, you know, it was not a group of college-educated, English-speaking. The whole meeting was in Hindi. It was on a floor in a small community. And what was also interesting is that they said often what they didn't get from the women's movement, they often got in their own communities and in their own families. So very interesting shifts and perceptions of where we may think. So I mean, I don't know. I know that from our experience that this is certainly a real struggle for the women's movement in different parts of the world.
It is a struggle in a way, and perhaps we're just not at that stage where, because when I look at all the issues that women organize around, you kind of have a critical mass of people who are affected by problem A or problem B, who get together and say, hey, let's do something about this. So that's why I'm like, it could be that it's work in progress in a way, but most of the subgroups within the wider movement are also still very much preoccupied with getting somewhere, whether it's a land issue, whether it's FGM they're dealing with. That hasn't really come up as an issue for broader, though there have been attempts. I do know of like one or two groups in the country whom I hear of, but who are not necessarily participating actively in the main movement.